Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing I Saw the TV Glow. In 1996, withdrawn 7th grader Owen strikes up a friendship with troubled 9th grader Maddie, who he notices reading an episode guide for the young adult television series The Pink Opeg. Though daunted by its dense mythology, Owen falls in love with the series. I Saw the TV Glow is directed by Jane Schoenbrun and stars Justice Smith and Brigette Lundy-Paine. So Jeffrey, what did you think about I Saw the TV Glow?
Jane's first film was We're All Going to the World's Fair, which is a film that felt so in and of itself, not only stylistically, but also temporally. It's a film that's so in and of internet culture in one of the most profound ways I've really ever seen on film. It came with this unique and very deep understanding of a particular kind of 21st century loneliness and isolation, but it also came with an odd reverence. It seemed to understand deeply how this is both a savior and a trap for lonely people. And it was really impressive on a lot of levels that just resonated with me very acutely when that film came out. I Saw the TV Glow in a lot of ways is actually more skillful, deeper, certainly more intertextual, perhaps even better made, but I think is also a bit more of a hollow experience than their first film. I had this sensation a few times during the film. I remember it during the title sequence. There's this parachute that we all used to play with as a kid in gym class, where we would all put it up and go under. Later on in the planetarium, there's a monologue that I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point. But there are times where the filmmaking, the storytelling, and the distinct style here are meshing together so perfectly, especially with the soundtrack, that I felt my spine tingle at a couple times. And they're so perfectly composed in those moments. But those scenes seem to exist in this quiet, evolving sense that goes in a multitude of directions. All of them interesting, all of them I think worthy of their own film, but I left the theater feeling like it was a film made by a deep thinker who simply needed to focus their energies into a singular thematic story structure the way they were so successful at focusing at a singular vision and a singular aesthetic. The film in its imagery and its aesthetic and its general vibe feels so singular. Like I've never seen anything like this from a purely visual standpoint, something that both pays homage to and subverts an entire decade's worth of media culture while building this lonely, creepy experience. I think you can tell that I'm probably vacillating between huge compliments and also strange criticisms that I feel really mixed on the film. Like I was so impressed by so much of what I saw in the visual execution, but I felt left so cold by a lot of the emotional and intellectual execution.
Let's start with the 90s theme, because this movie does have this very particular aesthetic about it, and it was one of my favorite things about the movie itself. I loved how the movie really displayed this youthful sense of its character surroundings, and I found the way that was captured to be very beautifully shown to us. It was a very colorful film. There was a lot of cool different lights and textures, and there was tons of nostalgic physical references, like an ice cream truck, the parachute playground that you were talking about. Yeah. And all of these things existed within this quintessential suburban neighborhood. It really did feel like childhood, particularly to me. I would say I do think the film is going for a very particular experience of childhood. It's somebody who grew up middle class in a suburban neighborhood and had these same experiences, most likely queer. I would understand if people saw this film and didn't really feel that they were as connected to it. I think that could have to do with few feelings of loneliness as well. If you didn't really feel like you had much of a lonely childhood, you might not relate to this film as much.
Who doesn't feel like they had a lonely childhood?
I don't know.
Want to hang out with that person. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
But I will say I really enjoyed this movie, and I felt most of the times connected to a lot of its themes. Things like the constricting and debilitating feelings of not being true to oneself, the fading of childlike wonder and imagination as people go into adulthood. While personally, I found these films to be a little overt in the movie, it doesn't hide what it is showing in terms of these themes. I mean, the little evil person in the movie is called
Mr. Melancholy.
Mr. Melancholy.
Yeah, and by the way, they go to Void School, and their team is the Vultures. Vulture. Yeah, it's a little on the nose.
But regardless of those things, I really connected with them and I enjoyed their simplicity. And maybe that's because all those feelings that I had like back as a teenager and a child were simple. They were feelings of just overwhelming sadness and not really knowing how to put it into words.
I think it's a film that could have a very overwhelming effect on somebody because it is so uniquely intertextual to 90s culture. We saw a Q&A with the star after the film, and Brigette said that a very large influence on the film was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's particularly something that was an influence on the Pink Opeg show. That's clearly evident from the onset. Like, that's a show that dealt with heavy, very dark subject matter, but in a very distinctly campy way, in a very distinctly 90s way. I also listened to a podcast with Adam Naiman where he was talking about the film. He talked about all of these other references that I didn't pick up on at all. REM and The Adventures of Pete and Pete, top to bottom with references that are deeply felt, I think, by the filmmaker and to me almost feel like a trap in some way. At some point, the contents of the film almost feel more like an encyclopedia of the 90s rather than an exploration of its effects. But I do want to focus a little bit on the film's aesthetics, which I think is really tied to what we're talking about, because the film's imagery is so extraordinary in so many places that it's clearly like one of my favorite parts of the film. So the film opens with the giant parachute that we talked about a couple of times now, like what a throwback that was. And there's this melancholy music playing, and as soon as the title card came up, I just felt like that feeling wash over me. And that was one of the most emotional times that I had during that film. There's also a fleeting image of an ice cream truck that's bathed in this blue light. It's on fire, but the flames are blue. We see later is very important symbolism for the pink opaque show. When he first encounters the tree down, there's blue static all across everything. It's a shot from a lower angle, so it's almost like he's walking to something dangerous that's really heightening the dread. The monologue later in the film that, I don't know, maybe we'll talk about the monologue in some way, but just the way that it's filmed is extraordinary. The constellations are going in the planetarium, which I don't think you see at first, but you see them reflected in flashes on her face as she's talking, and it gives this really extraordinarily hypnotic effect. A visual note that I've just never seen in a film before, and I'll talk later on and get more specific about some of my disappointments with the themes, but I really don't want to undermine how interesting this film is from a visual perspective. And if you're looking for a film that is a very particular vibe and you're cool with that, I think that this movie is going to be something pretty unbelievable to you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought of Are You Afraid of the Dark in terms of those visual 90s references, but it is crazy how the film plays as a show within a show. Our main characters see this show on television, and little do we know that's part of real life in a way. I will say this, show within the show, when they're watching the show on TV, I thought those things were really well done because it felt cheesy, but it was the perfect right of cheesy. The way that the credits roll on top of the screen, the way the shots even looked, there was a lot of thought put into how those sequences are shot to invoke the nostalgia of what those shows actually look like. It made me think of Alex Mack for some reason too. But going into the aesthetic and the feeling of the movie, I would talk about the camera work a little bit here. I loved how the camera work really was referencing maybe the discontent of our characters and the place that they're in their life. They're very disoriented. They don't even know where they're going in life. They're very confused individuals. There were certain times where it felt very dizzying to me, how shaky the camera was, and it was very disorienting. So while I liked how it had a reflection on the characters and their state of mind, I did think it was a little bit too much.
I actually think that idea dovetails very nicely into me thinking the filmmaker took on too many themes, because I also think that they take on too many filming styles. This film is really like a kitchen sink in a lot of ways. There are all these different filming styles, all these different filming techniques, all of this amazing imagery, and again, about every theme under the sun of a coming of age or depressing, sad movie about young people going on here.
Why don't we get a little bit deeper into the themes of the movie? I think from here, if you haven't seen I Saw the TV Glow, I would recommend coming back to this review, as a lot of this conversation will be spoilery and talk about the ending in particular. The main theme I thought about the movie was really the repercussions of not being your true self. The effects that has on you personally, the longer you go not admitting to the person that you truly are. I don't think this theme was as prevalent in the beginning of the movie. It does seem like the movie is addressing so many different themes at the beginning, and then about like 40 minutes to the end, there's this switch that happens where we find out that the show isn't just a show, it is the reality. That is where the thematics of the movie, I think, really take a turn.
Yeah, I think tied to the idea that you're talking about is perhaps one of my issues with the film. I think the characters are closer to epitomizing ideas rather than they are fleshed out characters. Obviously, one of the larger ideas in the film is what I mentioned before, that the culture that we consume, it both saves us and it destroys us if it supplants our real life. At a certain point, our memories of our childhood and the TV shows we watch become intertwined and suffused and much more difficult to differentiate as we look back on them. Owen says to Maddie at one point, the Pink Opaque was just a TV show. I remember cooking with my mom. I remember going to games with my dad, and Maddie seems to only remember the show. We're embodying this idea of the real versus imagined life, and which is which, almost like we're choosing to be in the Matrix or outside of it. It's a tale as old as time. It's clearly a choice, and the characters have a way of talking that's deliberately devoid of feeling and emotion, like it's very monotone. Talking with so much removed that it's probably further evidence that they are in some kind of TV show or some alternate life. I found that to be an interesting choice because I understand what they were going for, meaning the filmmaker, thematically by making that choice. But at the same time, I did feel like it added an extra layer of remove from the film that I didn't think was perfect. It reminds me a lot of Mulholland Drive, actually. Naomi Watts in that film, like her acting in the first part is deliberately bad. It's way too sunny. They purposely use poorly overdubbed dialogue so that we're shown it's in this fantasy world of Hollywood she's a part of. I think it's a very similar idea here, but the difference is we get to see a lot of Naomi Watts' character outside of the fantasy world in order to feel empathy for that character, which frankly I think is something that we're sorely missing here. We spend so much time in what I can only assume is this fantasy reality with the fractions of selves of these characters. If the pink opaque is freedom and what we're seeing them in is a trapped alternate reality in these like buried perspective, it's hard to feel something for them without seeing more glimpses of the true selves they could be. We're left with these hollowed out characters in service of the story and the themes. So it also means that a fundamental metaphor of the film becomes really muddled at that point, and frankly a little too obvious, like we've talked about. There's a very fine line between trope and commentary, and there are times the film employs tropes, I think, without the depth of commentary. It just all feels rather on the nose. And the film's dialogue, too, has this way of asking questions that it thinks are very thoughtful, but I don't think fit very effectively into the narrative.
For me, I would say it didn't matter so much that they felt like hollowed out characters because I was resonating so much with the hollowed out versions of themselves because that's how I felt during those times. I didn't need to see the other side of them because I already resonated. I knew, like I felt like I could feel that person on a deeper level already.
I understand. And again, I do think that's the intention. I just think it's miscalculated in terms of distilling what we know as great screenwriting into something that can be affecting. Because then to me, if we're not going at that depth level, it's really just a vibe. That's the wall I have and the distance I have from the film and why I can't penetrate into those feelings.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about a particular moment where Owen revisits the show later on down the
Oh, yeah, I have this too. That's one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Well, you can't really loud there.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, that's like my favorite part of the movie.
He goes and rewatches the show years later, and it seems lower budget. It seems silly, like they were cutting corners. And to me, I felt like it was a commentary on how our own youthful imaginations made the shows that we loved back then so much better than they actually were. It goes to show as kids that I think we used our own imaginations to make the world around us seem better. It had me questioning like nostalgia itself, as if the warm feelings are really just from a small moment in time and not really an accurate representation of life as it was as a whole back then. But it also reminded me how much TV, music, and video games were such a form of escapism for me. And I assume everybody else that was having the same feelings of loneliness back in those times.
That happens in the last 20 or so minutes of the film. And the ending has a lot to do, and you kind of mentioned this before, about unrealized dreams and romanticizing the past. That's a really amazing little snippet when he rewatches the show, almost as if memory is more important than what the show actually was. Like, we've all had this experience of watching a very formative film, a very formative TV show that we really liked, and we go back to it and we say, oh man, that was not as good as I remember it. You realize it's far more flawed than your young eyes could have realized.
And I will embarrass myself right now by admitting that there was this moment where I was like obsessed with the Transporter series, like back in the day when I was like in high school. Then the third one I thought was amazing. And then I had you watch it with me. Like, it had to be like 15, 20 years later. And it was so bad. I didn't realize how bad it was. But in my mind, I thought it was so amazing the first time I saw it.
That dovetails into the final sequences really well, where time begins moving faster, right? Suddenly, Owen is older. His life is flashing before his eyes. And as all these things happen around him, he looks back with remorse at what his life became. And deep down, he knows, and we as an audience probably know at this point, that he's buried himself. And that's why there's this screaming sequence towards the end. It's the only way that he can express himself before reverting back to the lie.
Yeah.
And I'm not the first person to say this, but I did think this in the theater before I had consumed any content about this film, that there's a lot of Charlie Kaufman in these closing sequences. I used the word snippet before when we were talking about how when he rewatched the show, it's uniquely like identifiable as a situation, but there are just snippets in a film that I think have about 30 other ideas or 30 other snippets going on without a great thread that's tying them together, in my opinion. So we're giving a little time to these themes and a little time to this theme, and we end up with a scattershot vision board of like 90s culture without like a great commentary on it. I love that scene that Owen is watching the show again and having all of these feelings, but it just felt like it was almost from another movie. And that scene with the scream and all of the apologizing and Charlie Kaufman-esque stuff, like looking back on your dreams, also felt like from another movie. If you look at this story structure of this film, it really feels like it has what I would want, what I would love in a film, but none of them feel fully realized.
To me, I didn't feel that way at all. I felt that the movie was the slow progression of a loss of identity and loss of self. By the end of the movie, I felt like Owen was just this hollowed out person that was playing a part. And to me, that absolutely felt devastating. When that scream hits, I felt that. I felt every single time I've had like a panic attack or anxiety building up on me to the point where you just feel like you have to release it all somehow in some way. And for Owen, this movie really ends in tragedy because they're unable to see that they're hiding themselves away. Owen is working this job that they don't like. They are struggling to breathe. And this all culminates with this very interesting sequence. I think that's what you meant by Kaufman-esque. Kaufman-esque,
Yeah.
when Owen cuts into their chest and reveals like
I think
the TV screen.
I think the whole thing is Kaufman-esque. You spend so much time obsessing about the idea, and then you look back on the life you missed and said, "Gosh, where did I go wrong?" That's a very Kaufman-esque idea. Actually, where you were going with the symbolism of him opening his chest and seeing the TV static, it's such an obvious metaphor for something that I think the film already underlined about 100 times.
I also want to touch on the planetarium monologue that you had mentioned a couple times because that really was another one of the best parts of the film.
It's the best scene in the movie, I think.
I think it's the best scene in the movie. So Brigette Lundy-Paine's monologue, I just loved how they slowly grew in emotion and urgency as they spoke. I thought it felt immediate, very raw, and very serious. Like the seriousness grew as the monologue came to a climax.
I agree, and I actually think that her performance brings a lot to the film that I'm looking for. Not necessarily Justice's performance, but his character that I felt like lacked that aspect. So because she had seen the pink opaque, she had been, outside of the matrix, so to speak, she has this sense of tragedy. And they happen to be such a phenomenal actor, but at the same time, that imbues more tragedy on this because we know what that character could be outside of this.
I think that's exactly why I related to Owen more. Because during this time, if we think about like our experiences growing up, you've definitely had a closer understanding of this type of tragedy in your mind already. I mean, you watched Pulp Fiction at the age of 11.
I know. I want to talk to your teachers and what you guys were reading at 14 years old, because you should have been reckoning with some of these ideas at 14 years old, but whatever.
Look, I was a very, what would you call it? Sheltered child.
And I corrupted you.
In certain ways, I did feel like I had a lonely childhood dealing with being gay and feeling like it was a part of myself that I was hiding away. It was very hard for me to open up to people. It was very hard to figure out who I was to be around people. Sometimes I feel like I would mold myself to be what I thought other people wanted me to be, because that would just be an easier way of me to navigate the world around me. And that is a very hollow experience. I didn't really need much more from Owen's character because I saw it all. It was all there. It all felt so buried and deep.
Yeah, you were able to fill it in with your experience.
I was able to fill it in with my experience, just like I think with Bridget's character, Maddie, you were able to fill in their character with your experiences.
Yeah, and the fact that you relate to the film so deeply, I think many other people will too. And that's the reason that I'm glad the film exists. Even if I say, like, as a critic, that I ultimately don't think that this film works, I am glad that it exists because I do think it will unlock some things for people that can have a true effect on somebody and maybe make them have a revelation about themselves. That's why I am glad that the film's around.
Escaping that is no small feat. That is a very difficult thing to overcome. The end of the movie is very depressing, I would say. It seems like Owen has not learned their true self and they're going on playing this part still.
Yeah, during the Q&A, they asked the audience to raise your hand if you think Owen is going to be okay, and nobody raised their hands. So are you ready to go to grades?
I am ready to go to grades. I saw the TV Glow an A-.
Wow, that's high. Okay, so when the movie ended, you said, "Hey, how do you feel about the movie?"
Yeah.
And I gave you like a one.
We did thumbs, because we didn't want to say it.
But you did one of this, which
I did one of this.
Oh, I thought you were mixed slightly positive, and I was mixed slightly negative.
Oh no, I was like in between the thumbs up. And
so see what perspective does. Okay.
Yeah,
I would have never guessed A- from what you. Okay, that's interesting.
I absolutely adored the aesthetic of this movie. I really related to the feelings of being trapped in oneself and not really being able to express yourself, trying to figure out who you are as a person. So many of these things feel so lost when you're in the closet. As much as I felt like it had a sad ending, I wish it had a happy ending. That unhappy ending, unfortunately, is the experience of so many queer people out there. And I hope that those people, as they grow, can find the ability to emerge from whatever parts they're playing in themselves.
Yeah, the film does go pretty hard in some sequences towards the end. There's a scene in the bathtub where he's like throwing up the blue static with his dad that is very harrowing, and the raw sound of Owen's scream during one of those last scenes is a lot. In a lot of ways, I think this is a more interesting film to talk about than it is ultimately successful, which may sound like the antithesis of this channel. Like, if we can talk about a film for 50 minutes or however long we've been talking about this movie, that's a sign of success to some degree. But again, I think it means that the film is really deeply considered and really intelligent. And you can tell that in the interviews with Jane that I've read and listened to. But it's almost as if, as a filmmaker, they jumped into a deep pool and couldn't come back up for air. So many competing, complex ideas that were not distilled into the fundamentals of screenwriting, like story or structure or character arcs, at least in my opinion. I think perhaps like the criticisms that we were talking about of the way I'm perceiving the film is like, you just want things spoon-fed to you, or you just want normal plot structure. And I don't want that at all. Like, I want the film to remain ambiguous and challenge its audience and really reckon with the complexity of its ideas, but to filter it through a lens that's focused and perceptible. I absolutely love David Lynch. Like, I compared this film to Mulholland Drive. It's literally one of my favorite movies of all time. And he's all over this film influence-wise. And David Lynch's films have a way of exploring abstractions in a way that feels both complicated and singular. But in this film, I just felt more of a sense of an intellectual whiplash that just struck me as unfocused. Intellectually, it just feels miscalculated in a way that the aesthetic or the tone or the mood never does. As far as a mood piece, I'm not sure this film could be better. But as far as its ideas, it never struck gold for me. So anyway, I'm going to give it a B-.
All right, and that's it for our review of I Saw the TV Glow. I Saw the TV Glow is now in theaters, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out, because I would say it's a must-watch, as well as Jeffrey for all his criticisms.
No, you should definitely go see it.
Definitely go see it. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about I Saw the TV Glow? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.